I stared at the text message from my mother-in-law, Carol, my hands trembling slightly as I read her words for the third time. Emma, we need to talk. The family has some concerns about your intentions with Michael. Perhaps it's time we had an honest conversation about your background. The carefully chosen words felt like ice water in my veins. After 2 years of marriage and 3 years of dating before that, they still saw me as the gold-digging waitress who had somehow ensnared their precious son. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony of their assumptions would have been laughable if it weren't so heartbreaking. I met Michael Thompson on what should have been one of the worst days of my life. It was a rainy Tuesday in October, and I was pulling a double shift at Romano's, the upscale Italian restaurant where I'd been working for almost 2 years. The lunch rush had been brutal, my feet were killing me in the cheap shoes I could barely afford, and I'd already dealt with 3 difficult customers who seemed to think their bad moods gave them permission to treat their server like dirt. That's when he walked in, soaking wet from the downpour outside, his expensive suit rumpled and his usually perfect hair plastered to his forehead. He looked nothing like the polished financial advisor I would later learn he was. Instead, he looked lost, frustrated, and surprisingly human. Most of our clientele carried themselves with an air of superiority that made my job infinitely harder, but there was something different about this man. I approached his table with my practiced smile, the one I'd perfected after years of service industry work. Good afternoon, what can I get started for you today? He looked up from his phone with eyes that were a startling shade of green, and for a moment, I forgot my rehearsed greeting. I'm sorry, he said, and his voice carried genuine regret. I know I look like I've been through a hurricane. My car broke down about 6 blocks from here, and I've been walking in this weather for 20 minutes trying to find somewhere decent to wait while the tow truck comes. I found myself genuinely smiling for the first time that day. Well, you've certainly found the right place to wait out a storm. Can I get you something warm to drink while you decide on food? Coffee would be amazing, he said, running his hand through his damp hair, and maybe you could recommend something. I have to admit, I don't usually eat at places this nice. I'm more of a grab a sandwich at my desk kind of guy. His honesty was refreshing. Most customers at Romano's acted like dining there was beneath them, even while spending hundreds of dollars on a single meal. Here was someone who clearly could afford to eat anywhere he wanted, but he wasn't putting on airs about it. I spent the next few minutes walking him through the menu, and I was struck by how attentively he listened, how he asked thoughtful questions about ingredients and preparation. When I recommended the osso buco, explaining that it was our chef's specialty and perfect for a cold, rainy day, his face lit up with genuine interest. You really know your stuff, he said as I finished describing the dish. Have you worked here long? Almost 2 years, I replied, proud of the stability I'd managed to achieve. It wasn't glamorous work, but Romano's was a good restaurant with fair management, and the tips were decent enough to help me save money while I figured out my next steps. Well, I'll trust your judgment completely, he said, closing the menu with a decisive snap. Osso buco it is. As I walked back to the kitchen to place his order, I found myself thinking about his smile, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed at something I'd said about the weather. I'd served thousands of customers over the years, but none had made such an immediate impression. When I returned with his coffee, he was on his phone, speaking in low professional tones about market projections and client portfolios. I tried not to eavesdrop, but it was clear he worked in finance, probably for one of the big firms downtown. The contrast between his earlier vulnerability and his current professional demeanor was intriguing. The lunch crowd began to thin out, and I found myself making excuses to check on his table more frequently than necessary. Each time he greeted me with the same warm smile, sometimes pausing his work to make small talk about the weather, the restaurant, or the book I'd noticed him reading between phone calls. Dostoevsky, I asked during one of my visits, nodding toward the worn paperback copy of Crime and Punishment beside his plate. His eyebrows shot up in surprise. You know Dostoevsky? I felt heat rise to my cheeks. I majored in literature before. I caught myself before finishing the sentence. Before my father's business collapsed. Before my family lost everything. Before I had to drop out of graduate school and take whatever work I could find. Before I ended up here, I finished lamely, but Michael didn't seem to notice my discomfort. Instead, his eyes brightened with genuine excitement. Really? What did you think of the brothers Karamazov? I've been meaning to tackle that one next, but everyone tells me it's impossibly dense. For the next 10 minutes, we talked about Russian literature, about the way Dostoevsky could make you feel simultaneously hopeful and devastated, about the philosophical questions that kept you awake at night, long after you'd finished reading. It had been months since I'd had a conversation about anything more substantial than drink specials and daily soup selections, and I found myself reluctant to end it. I should probably let you get back to work, Michael said eventually, glancing around the now nearly empty dining room. But this has been the best part of my day, by far. Mine too, I admitted, then immediately worried I'd been too forward, but he smiled that crooked smile again, and I felt my heart do something complicated in my chest. I don't suppose you'd be interested in continuing this conversation sometime. Maybe somewhere where you're not working and I'm not dripping rainwater all over everything. I should have said no. I'd learned through painful experience that customers who asked servers out were usually looking for something casual and temporary, something that would inevitably end with me feeling used, and them moving on to the next pretty face. But there was something different about Michael, something in the way he looked at me like he actually saw me, not just the uniform and the service smile. I'd like that, I heard myself saying. He pulled out his business card, writing his personal number on the back in neat handwriting. Michael Thompson, he said as he handed it to me. And you are? Emma, I replied, tucking the card carefully into my apron pocket. Emma Walsh. Well, Emma Walsh, it's been a pleasure meeting you. I'll call you soon if that's okay. After he left, leaving a tip that was generous but not ostentatiously so, I found myself replaying our conversation over and over. There had been no condescension in his manner, no assumption that because I was serving his lunch, I was somehow beneath him intellectually or socially. He'd talked to me like an equal, like someone whose opinions mattered. 3 days later, he called. We met for coffee at a small cafe near the university, neutral territory where neither of us had any professional obligations. The conversation flowed even more easily than it had at the restaurant. We talked about books and movies, about travel dreams and childhood memories, about everything except what we did for work. It wasn't until our third date that I learned exactly who Michael Thompson was. We were walking through the park after dinner, and he was telling me about his childhood when he mentioned his family's business. Thompson Financial Group, he said casually, as if it weren't one of the most prestigious wealth management firms in the city. My grandfather started it in the 50s, and my father built it into what it is today. I always knew I'd end up working there eventually. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but my mind was racing. Thompson Financial Group managed portfolios for some of the wealthiest families in the state. Their office building downtown was a gleaming monument to success and old money. And here I was, a college dropout working as a waitress, holding hands with the heir to a financial empire. That's impressive, I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. Michael stopped walking and turned to face me, his expression serious. Emma, I hope you know that what I do for work, what my family does, none of that matters to me when I'm with you. I mean, it matters in the sense that I'm lucky to have opportunities that not everyone gets, but it doesn't define who I am. At least I hope it doesn't. His sincerity was unmistakable, but I still felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. I'd been down this road before, in a different way. I knew what it was like to have people's perceptions of you change the moment they learned about your background, whether that background was wealth or the lack of it. What about your family? I asked quietly. What will they think about you dating a waitress? Michael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. My family can be particular about certain things, but they don't get to choose who I date, Emma. I do. Even then, I should have recognized the warning signs. The slight hesitation before he answered, the way his shoulders tensed when I mentioned his family, the careful diplomatic language he used. But I was already falling for him, already imagining a future where our different backgrounds wouldn't matter, where love would be enough to bridge any gap. Our relationship progressed slowly but steadily over the next several months. Michael was nothing like the entitled rich boys I'd encountered during my brief time at the university. He was kind, thoughtful, genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions. He never made me feel inferior because of my job or my circumstances. When I told him I'd had to leave school for financial reasons, he listened with compassion, not judgment. But he was also careful about introducing me to his world. We went to movies and small restaurants, took long walks, spent quiet evenings at my tiny apartment talking about everything and nothing. He rarely mentioned his family, and when he did, it was usually in the context of work obligations or social commitments that he seemed to view as necessary but burdensome. 6 months into our relationship, I finally met his family at a charity gala his firm was sponsoring. Michael had been reluctant to take me, claiming the events were boring and stuffy, but I'd insisted. I wanted to be part of his life, all of it, and that included the parts he seemed determined to keep separate. I spent weeks preparing for that night. I saved up for a dress that was elegant but not too expensive, practiced walking in heels I could barely afford, researched the charity so I'd have something intelligent to contribute to conversations. I wanted his family to see that I was worthy of their son, that I could fit into their world if given the chance. The moment I walked into the hotel ballroom on Michael's arm, I knew I'd made a mistake. This wasn't just a charity gala, it was a showcase of old money and established power. The women wore jewelry that probably cost more than I made in a year, and the men moved through the crowd with the easy confidence that comes from never having to worry about anything as mundane as money. Michael's parents, Richard and Carol Thompson, were holding court near the bar when we approached them. Richard was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested he'd never doubted his place in the world. Carol was elegant in that effortless way that only comes from a lifetime of privilege, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her smile polished and practiced. "Mother, father," Michael said, his voice carrying a formality I'd never heard before. "I'd like you to meet Emma Walsh." Carol's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in her blue eyes as she looked me up and down, taking in my dress, my shoes, my entire appearance in one calculating glance. "How lovely to finally meet you, dear," she said, extending a manicured hand. "Michael has mentioned you." Richard's handshake was firm but brief, and I caught him exchanging a meaningful look with his wife over my head. "Emma," he said pleasantly enough, "what is it that you do?" The question I'd been dreading. I lifted my chin and met his gaze directly. "I work at Romano's downtown. It's an Italian restaurant." "How interesting," Carol said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. "And what are your long-term plans?" Michael stepped closer to me, his hand finding mine. "Emma's incredibly well-read," he said, pride evident in his voice. "She was a literature major before she had to take a break from school." I wanted to disappear. His attempt to defend me only highlighted how much I didn't belong here, how out of place I was among these people who'd never had to work a service job to pay their bills. The rest of the evening was an exercise in polite torture. I was introduced to family, friends, and business associates, each conversation a careful navigation of class differences and unspoken judgments. Some people were kind, if distant, others were barely polite. But through it all, I felt the weight of Carol's disapproval, the way she watched me interact with their social circle, as if I were a fascinating but potentially dangerous specimen. The breaking point came when I overheard Carol talking to another woman near the ladies' room. I'd been heading inside to touch up my makeup when I heard my name and froze just outside the door. "She seems sweet enough," the other woman was saying, "but Michael could do so much better. The Henderson's daughter Sarah is back from Paris, you know, she'd be perfect for him." "Don't I know it," Carol replied, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy women use when they're discussing problems that need to be solved.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Michael's always been too soft-hearted for his own good. He sees a pretty face and a sob story, and he thinks he can save everyone. "You don't think it's serious?" "I hope not. Though men his age can be so impulsive, she's probably already calculating how much she can get out of him." I stood frozen in the hallway, my face burning with humiliation and anger. These women were discussing me like I was a problem to be managed, a threat to be neutralized. The worst part was the casual certainty in Carol's voice. the assumption that of course I was after Michael's money, that there could be no other reason for our relationship. When I finally returned to the table, Michael took one look at my face and immediately asked what was wrong. I forced a smile and made an excuse about feeling tired, but I could see he wasn't convinced. The ride home was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we were back at my apartment that I finally told him what I'd overheard. I watched his face change as I repeated his mother's words, saw the anger and disappointment war with what looked like resignation. "Emma, I'm so sorry," he said, pulling me into his arms. "My mother can be protective. Sometimes she says things without thinking. She called me a gold digger, Michael. She thinks I'm with you for your money. She doesn't know you like I do. Once she gets to know you better, she'll see what I see." But even as he said the words, I could hear the doubt in his voice. And I began to understand that this wasn't going to be a problem that would solve itself with time and patience. This was going to be a battle, and I wasn't sure I had the weapons to fight it. Over the next year, things between Michael and me only grew stronger, but the tension with his family remained a constant undercurrent. There were family dinners where I felt like I was being interviewed for a job I could never qualify for, holiday gatherings where I was included, but never quite welcomed, social events where I was introduced as Michael's friend rather than his girlfriend. Carol, in particular, had perfected the art of subtle hostility. She never said anything directly offensive, but her comments were surgical in their precision. She'd ask about my work with feigned interest, then immediately change the subject to something more suitable. She'd mention other young women Michael might find interesting, always with the caveat that she was just thinking of expanding his social circle. She'd make observations about the importance of shared backgrounds and values in relationships, delivered with such sweetness that it took a moment to register the sting. Richard was less obvious but perhaps more effective in his disapproval. He simply acted as if I didn't exist most of the time, addressing his son directly even when I was standing right beside him, discussing family business and future plans as if Michael were still single and unattached. The pressure began to affect Michael too. I could see him growing more tense before family gatherings, more apologetic afterward. He started making excuses for his parents' behavior, explaining their concerns as coming from a place of love and protection. But I could also see the guilt in his eyes, the way he was torn between loyalty to his family and his feelings for me. The situation came to a head during Christmas of our second year together. Michael had invited me to spend Christmas Eve with his family, a significant step that I'd been hoping for but also dreading. I spent weeks preparing, buying gifts that were thoughtful but not expensive, practicing conversations in my head, psyching myself up for what I knew would be a challenging evening. The Thompson family home was everything I'd expected, and more. It was a sprawling colonial in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city, decorated with understated elegance that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. Every detail was perfect, from the enormous Christmas tree in the living room to the professionally arranged garland draped along the staircase. The family had gathered in the living room for drinks before dinner, and I found myself sitting slightly apart from the main group, nursing a glass of wine and trying to contribute to conversations about people and places I'd never heard of. Michael's sister Jennifer was there with her husband David, both lawyers who worked for prestigious firms downtown. They were polite to me but clearly shared their parents' reservations about their brother's choice in girlfriends. The evening might have been merely uncomfortable, rather than devastating if it hadn't been for the arrival of Sarah Henderson. Carol had mentioned her several times over the past year, always in the context of what a lovely girl she was, how accomplished, how perfect she'd be for someone like Michael. Sarah was, I had to admit, everything I wasn't. She was tall and elegant, with the kind of understated beauty that came from good genes and expensive maintenance. She moved through the Thompson home like she belonged there, greeting everyone with easy familiarity, sharing inside jokes and fond memories from childhood. "Sarah's just back from a year in London," Carol announced as she made introductions. She was working for Sotheby's, learning about art authentication. Such fascinating work. "Oh, it was incredible," Sarah said, her voice carrying that particular accent that suggested expensive boarding schools and European finishing schools. "I learned so much about Renaissance paintings. Michael, didn't you write your senior thesis on art as investment?" And just like that, they were deep in conversation about subjects I knew nothing about, sharing references and experiences from a world I'd never been part of. I watched Michael's face light up as they talked, saw him relaxing in a way he rarely did around his family when I was present. I tried to participate, to find openings in their conversation, but every comment I made seemed to fall flat. When I mentioned visiting the local art museum, Sarah smiled kindly and said how wonderful it was that I was interested in culture. When I asked about her work in London, she launched into a detailed explanation that made it clear how little I understood about the art world. But the real blow came during dinner. The conversation had turned to travel, and Sarah was regaling the table with stories from her various trips around Europe. Michael was listening with obvious interest, asking questions about places he'd visited with his family, sharing his own travel experiences. "We should plan a trip together sometime," Sarah said casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I know some wonderful little places in Tuscany that most tourists never find." The table went quiet for a moment, and I felt every eye turn toward me. Michael looked uncomfortable, clearly caught between his desire not to hurt my feelings and his inability to extend the same invitation to me. We both knew I couldn't afford to travel to Europe, could barely afford to travel outside the city. "That sounds wonderful," Carol said smoothly, breaking the tension. "Michael's always loved Italy. Remember that summer you spent in Florence during college?" And the conversation moved on, leaving me sitting there with the clear understanding that there were parts of Michael's life, parts of his world, that would always be closed to me. Not because he didn't care about me, but because the practical realities of our different circumstances made them impossible. The final humiliation came as we were preparing to leave. I was helping clear the dinner dishes, a gesture that felt natural to me but that clearly marked me as someone unused to being served. As I carried plates to the kitchen, I overheard Carol talking to Sarah in the hallway. "She's trying so hard, isn't she?" Carol was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone of condescending pity. "It's almost painful to watch." "Mother, please," I heard Jennifer's voice, though she didn't sound particularly upset. "I'm just saying, Michael deserves someone who can match him intellectually and socially. Someone who understands his world. This little waitress fantasy has gone on long enough." I stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, the plates trembling in my hands. The casual cruelty of her words, the dismissive way she referred to me as a little waitress fantasy, cut deeper than any direct insult could have. When Michael and I finally left that night, the ride home was silent except for my quiet tears. He tried to comfort me, to explain his family's behavior, to assure me that their opinions didn't matter to him. But I could see the doubt in his eyes, the way the evening had affected him too. "Maybe they're right," I said finally as we sat in his car outside my apartment building. "Maybe we're too different. Maybe I don't belong in your world." "Emma, don't say that," Michael said, taking my hand. "I love you, that's what matters." But love, I was beginning to understand, might not be enough to overcome the obstacles we faced. The pressure from his family, the constant feeling of being judged and found wanting, the exhaustion of always having to prove myself worthy of a place I might never truly be welcome in. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the evening's events, I made a decision that would change everything. I couldn't continue living in this limbo, couldn't keep subjecting myself to the subtle humiliations and obvious disapproval of Michael's family. Something had to change. What I didn't know was that change was already coming, in a form none of us could have anticipated. The very assumptions that Michael's family had made about me, the financial desperation they were so certain motivated my relationship with their son, were about to be turned completely upside down. But first I had to survive the aftermath of that Christmas Eve dinner, had to find a way to salvage my relationship with Michael, while protecting what remained of my dignity and self-respect. Little did I know that within weeks everything would change, and the family who had spent 2 years looking down on me as a gold-digging waitress would discover just how wrong they had been about who I really was. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in January, exactly 3 weeks after that disastrous Christmas Eve dinner. I was getting ready for another double shift at Mykonos, trying to shake off the lingering depression that had settled over me since the holidays, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Emma Walsh?" The voice was crisp, professional, with a slight British accent. "Yes, this is Emma. Miss Walsh, my name is Victoria Blackwood from Blackwood and Associates. I'm calling regarding your grandmother's estate. I believe we need to schedule a meeting as soon as possible." I nearly dropped the phone. My grandmother had died when I was 15, and as far as I knew, there had been no estate to speak of. Grandma Rose had lived modestly in a small apartment across town, surviving on Social Security and a small pension from her years working as a seamstress. "I think there might be some mistake," I said slowly. "My grandmother Rose Walsh passed away 8 years ago. There wasn't really an estate." "Miss Walsh, I'm afraid there's been a significant development. Could you possibly come to our offices this afternoon? I'd prefer to discuss this matter in person." Something in her tone made my stomach clench. "Is everything all right? Is this about debt or something?" "Quite the opposite, I assure you. Shall we say 2 o'clock? I called in sick to work, a luxury I could rarely afford, and spent the rest of the morning in a state of confused anxiety. The address Victoria Blackwood had given me was in the financial district, in one of those gleaming towers that house the city's most prestigious law firms. As I stood in the marble lobby, looking up at the directory, I felt the familiar intimidation that came with entering spaces designed for people much wealthier than myself. Blackwood and Associates occupied the entire 42nd floor, and their offices were exactly what I'd expected from a high-end legal firm. Rich wood paneling, expensive artwork, the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted about money. Victoria Blackwood herself was an elegant woman in her 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, and a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She greeted me warmly, but with a professionalism that suggested this wasn't a social call. "Please sit down," she said, gesturing to a leather chair across from her massive desk. "Can I offer you coffee, tea, water?" "I'm fine, thank you," I said, though my mouth felt dry as sand. "Miss Blackwood, I have to say I'm completely confused about why I'm here." She opened a thick file folder and pulled out several documents. "Miss Walsh, what I'm about to tell you may come as quite a shock. Your grandmother, Rose Walsh, was not who you believed her to be." My heart started beating faster. "What do you mean? Your grandmother was born Rose Pemberton. She was the daughter of Harrison Pemberton, who founded Pemberton Industries in 1952. The name hit me like a physical blow. Pemberton Industries was one of the largest manufacturing conglomerates in the country, with holdings in everything from automotive parts to aerospace technology. Their corporate headquarters was visible from Romano's windows, a gleaming monument to industrial success. "That's impossible," I whispered. "My grandmother was a seamstress. She lived in a tiny apartment. She clipped coupons and worried about paying her electric bill." Victoria's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Miss Walsh, your grandmother chose to live that way. She had a significant falling out with her family when she was 22 years old. She married your grandfather, Robert Walsh, against her family's wishes, and they disowned her. She chose love over money, and she chose to live as if the Pemberton fortune didn't exist." I felt like the room was spinning. "But why are you telling me this now? She's been dead for 8 years. "Because, Miss Walsh, Harrison Pemberton's will contained a very specific provision. If Rose predeceased him without reconciling with the family, her share of the estate would pass to her descendants after his death. Harrison Pemberton died last month at the age of 96.
Victoria slid a document across the desk toward me. The numbers on the page seemed to blur together, too large to process. "Miss Walsh, you've inherited approximately $47 million. The words hit me like a tsunami. I stared at the papers, at the legal language that might as well have been written in a foreign tongue, at the numbers that seemed impossible to comprehend. 47 million, I repeated numbly. The inheritance includes liquid assets, real estate holdings, and a trust fund that's been accumulating interest for over 30 years. Your grandmother's share of Pemberton Industries, which she never claimed, has been managed by our firm according to Harrison Pemberton's instructions." I felt like I was going to be sick. "This can't be real. I understand this is overwhelming," Victoria said kindly. "But I assure you it's very real. However, there are some complexities we need to discuss." For the next 2 hours, Victoria walked me through the labyrinthine details of my inheritance. There were tax implications, trust fund structures, real estate properties scattered across 3 states, and investment portfolios that I couldn't even begin to understand. But the bottom line was clear. I was now worth more money than I could have imagined in my wildest dreams. "There's one more thing," Victoria said as our meeting was winding down. "The Pemberton family is not particularly pleased about this development." "What do you mean?" "Your grandmother's siblings and their children have been expecting to inherit Harrison's entire estate. The discovery of your existence and your claim to a significant portion of the family wealth has created quite a stir. They've already indicated they may contest the will. My head was reeling. Not only had I just learned I was wealthy beyond imagination, but I was apparently about to be embroiled in a family feud with people I'd never met. Walsh, Victoria continued, I'd strongly recommend that you not make any major life changes or announcements until we've had time to fully process the inheritance and address any legal challenges. This kind of wealth can change relationships, and people don't always react well to sudden changes in fortune. I thought immediately of Michael, of his family's assumptions about my motives, of the countless humiliations I'd endured, because they thought I was after their money. The irony was so bitter I almost laughed. How long before this becomes public knowledge? I asked. Legal proceedings of this magnitude are difficult to keep completely private, especially when there's family opposition. I'd estimate you have perhaps a few weeks before word begins to spread in certain circles. I left the law office in a daze, clutching a folder full of documents that proved my new reality. As I walked through the financial district, past the gleaming buildings and expensive restaurants, I felt like an alien visitor observing a world I'd never thought I'd be part of. But more than anything, I felt angry. Angry at my grandmother for never telling me the truth. Angry at a family that had disowned her for following her heart. Angry at a world where money mattered more than character or kindness. And underneath it all, I felt a growing determination to handle this inheritance in a way that would honor my grandmother's memory while finally giving me the power to stand up to the people who had dismissed me for so long. The first person I told was Michael, and his reaction was everything I could have hoped for and everything I had feared. $47 million, he repeated, sitting on my couch with the same stunned expression I'd probably worn in Victoria's office. I know it's hard to believe. I'm still trying to process it myself. Michael was quiet for a long moment, staring at the legal documents spread across my coffee table. When he finally looked up at me, his expression was complicated. Emma, this changes everything. Does it? I asked, though I already knew the answer. My family has spent 2 years assuming you were after my money. Now it turns out you have more money than we do. The way he said we stung that unconscious grouping of himself with his family against me. But I tried to push past it. Michael, I'm still the same person I was yesterday. I'm still the same woman you fell in love with. I know that, he said quickly. Of course I know that. It's just this is going to be quite an adjustment. For everyone. Over the next few days I watched Michael struggle with the implications of my inheritance. He was happy for me, genuinely excited about the opportunities it would give me, but I could also see him wrestling with how this changed the dynamic of our relationship. He'd been the one with money, the one who picked up checks and paid for trips. Now, suddenly I could buy and sell his family's business several times over. The real test came when I suggested we tell his parents together. Michael had been putting off the conversation, claiming he needed time to process the news himself. But I was tired of secrets and half-truths. I think we should wait, he said when I brought it up again. Let the legal stuff get sorted out first. Make sure everything is legitimate. Michael, the lawyers have confirmed it. This is real, and your family deserves to know the truth about who they've been judging all this time. Emma, you don't understand how my mother is going to react to this. She's going to feel terrible about the things she's said. Good, maybe she should feel terrible. The sharpness in my voice surprised both of us. Michael looked at me with something I'd never seen before, a wariness that hurt more than any of his family's insults. You're different, he said quietly. Since you found out about the money, you're different. I'm not different, I'm just not apologizing for existing anymore. But even as I said it, I wondered if he was right. The knowledge of my inheritance had given me something I'd never had before, real power. The power to walk away from situations that demeaned me. The power to stand up to people who looked down on me. The power to stop caring what other people thought about my worth. I decided to tell Richard and Carol myself. I called Carol's personal assistant and scheduled lunch at the country club where she spent most of her afternoons. It was exactly the kind of power move that the old Emma would never have had the confidence to make. But I was beginning to understand that confidence was just another luxury that money could buy. Carol arrived 10 minutes late, her usual power play, dressed in tennis whites and carrying herself with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been kept waiting by anyone who mattered. She greeted me with the same cool politeness she'd always shown, though I detected a hint of surprise that I'd initiated the meeting. "Emma, how lovely to see you," she said, settling into her chair with practiced grace. "Michael said you wanted to discuss something." "I did, but first I wanted to apologize." Carol's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly. This clearly wasn't what she'd been expecting. "Apologize for what, dear?" "For not being honest with you about who I am." "I'm not sure I understand." I pulled out a folder containing copies of the inheritance documents Victoria had given me. "Mrs. Thompson, my real name is Emma Pemberton Walsh. I'm the granddaughter of Rose Pemberton and the great-granddaughter of Harrison Pemberton, who founded Pemberton Industries." Carol's face went through a series of expressions so rapidly it was almost comical. Confusion, disbelief, shock, and finally a kind of pale recognition as the implications sank in. "Pemberton Industries," she repeated faintly. "I've recently inherited my grandmother's share of the family estate. Approximately $47 million, plus various properties and ongoing business interests." The silence that followed was deafening. Carol stared at the documents as if they might burst into flames, her composed mask finally cracking to reveal something raw and desperate underneath. "This is impossible," she said finally. "You're a waitress." "I was a waitress," I corrected gently. "By choice, as it turns out, just like my grandmother chose to live modestly, rather than claim her family's wealth." Carol's hands were shaking slightly as she set down her water glass. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I wanted you to understand that every assumption you've made about me, every cruel comment about my motives, every attempt to make me feel unworthy of your son, was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who I am." I watched the color drain from Carol's face as the full weight of her behavior over the past 2 years hit her. Every snide comment about gold diggers, every pointed question about my intentions, every obvious attempt to push me out of Michael's life, suddenly took on a different context. "I never meant," she began, then stopped. "You never meant to be cruel to someone you thought was beneath you socially and financially. But you were perfectly comfortable being cruel to someone you thought was a poor waitress trying to climb the social ladder." Carol's composure finally cracked completely. "Emma, I am so sorry. I had no idea. If I had known, if you had known I was wealthy, you would have treated me with respect. But because you thought I was poor, you felt entitled to treat me like dirt. That's not, I never meant to." Carol was stammering now, her usual articulate confidence completely gone. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm not telling you this to humiliate you, though I'll admit there's some satisfaction in seeing you finally understand how wrong you've been. I'm telling you because I love your son, and I want us to find a way to move forward that doesn't involve me pretending to be less than I am to make you comfortable." Carol was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling to process this complete reversal of everything she'd believed about me and our relationship. "What do you want from us?" she asked finally. "I want an apology, a real one, not just for misjudging my financial status, but for the way you've treated me as a human being. I want acknowledgement that your behavior was wrong, regardless of how much money I did, or didn't have. And if I can't give you that," I smiled, and for the first time in 2 years it felt like I held all the cards, "then I'll make sure everyone in your social circle knows exactly how Harrison Pemberton's great-granddaughter was treated by the Thompson family. I imagine that will make for some interesting conversation at your next charity gala." It wasn't a threat, exactly, but it was a promise. Carol understood the implications immediately. In her world, social standing was everything, and being known as the woman who had bullied an heiress would be social suicide. "I'll need to discuss this with Richard," she said weakly. "Of course, take all the time you need, but Carol," I used her first name deliberately, claiming an equality I'd never dared assert before. "The days of you treating me like I'm lucky to be tolerated in your presence are over. Whether we move forward as family or as polite strangers is entirely up to you." I left the country club feeling lighter than I had in months. For the first time since I'd met Michael's family, I felt like I had some control over the situation. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and while I didn't intend to abuse that power, I was certainly going to use it to demand the respect I'd always deserved. The aftermath of my lunch with Carol was swift and dramatic. Within hours, my phone was ringing with calls from Michael, from Richard, from family members I barely knew who had apparently been given emergency briefings on the situation. Michael arrived at my apartment that evening looking shell-shocked. "Emma, what did you say to my mother?"
She's been locked in her room crying for hours, and my father is talking about hiring a private investigator to verify your story. I told her the truth, the same truth I told you. She said you threatened her. I told her there would be consequences if she continued to treat me poorly. That's not a threat, Michael. That's just reality." Michael sat down heavily on my couch, running his hands through his hair in the gesture I'd come to recognize as his stress response. "This is all happening so fast. A week ago you were Emma the waitress, and now you're Emma the heiress, and everyone's acting like the world has turned upside down." The world hasn't turned upside down, Michael. People's perceptions have changed. There's a difference, is there? Because honestly, Emma, you seem different too. More, I don't know. Harder maybe. His words stung because there was truth in them. I was different. The knowledge of my inheritance had given me a confidence I'd never possessed before, but it had also given me a clarity about how I'd been treated that was sometimes difficult to bear. "Maybe I am harder," I said. "Maybe having money has given me the luxury of not having to smile and nod when people insult me to my face. My family never insulted you to your face. Your mother called me a little waitress fantasy at Christmas dinner. She spent 2 years treating me like a charity case she was too polite to dismiss outright. How is that not insulting?" Michael was quiet for a moment, and I could see him struggling with the cognitive dissonance of defending his family's behavior while also acknowledging its cruelty. "What do you want from us, Emma? What would make this right?" "I want your family to treat me with the same respect they'd show any other woman you brought home. Not because I'm wealthy, but because I'm a human being who deserves basic courtesy. And if they can't do that..." The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications for our future together. "Then we'll have to decide what that means for us," I said quietly. That night, as I lay in bed thinking about the events of the day, I realized that my inheritance had done more than just change my bank account. It had changed the fundamental dynamic of every relationship in my life, with Michael, with his family, even with myself. For 2 years, I'd been so grateful to be loved by someone like Michael, so determined to prove myself worthy of his family's acceptance, that I'd lost sight of my own worth as a person. The money hadn't changed who I was, but it had given me the power to stop apologizing for existing. The question now was whether Michael and his family could accept this new version of me, the one who wouldn't shrink herself to fit their expectations. And if they couldn't, whether I was strong enough to walk away from the man I loved in order to preserve the person I was finally becoming. The next few days brought a parade of phone calls, flowers, and awkward apologies as the Thompson family scrambled to adjust to their new reality. Richard showed up at my apartment with a bottle of expensive wine and a formal apology that sounded like it had been written by his lawyer. Jennifer called to invite me to lunch, suddenly eager to discuss art and literature with someone who could now afford to collect both. But it was Carol's approach that surprised me most. Instead of the grand gesture I'd been expecting, she simply appeared at Romano's during my final shift there. I'd decided to finish out my 2 weeks' notice, despite my changed circumstances, partly because I didn't want to leave my coworkers in a bind, and partly because I needed the normalcy of routine while I adjusted to my new reality. Carol sat in my section and ordered coffee, waiting patiently until the lunch rush was over before asking if we could talk. "I've been thinking about what you said at the club," she began when I finally had a moment to sit down across from her. "About how I would have treated you differently if I'd known about your money." I waited, not sure where this was going. "You were right, I would have, and that makes me a terrible person." The simple honesty of her admission caught me off guard. This wasn't the polished apology I'd been expecting, full of excuses and justifications. "I've spent the last few days thinking about why I was so threatened by you," Carol continued. "And I think it's because you reminded me of everything I used to be before I married Richard." This was definitely not what I'd been expecting. "I wasn't born into money, Emma. I grew up in a trailer park outside Detroit. My father worked in a factory, and my mother cleaned houses. When I met Richard in college, I was working 3 jobs to pay my tuition." I stared at her, trying to reconcile this revelation with the polished society matron I'd known. "Richard's family treated me exactly the way I've been treating you. They assumed I was a gold digger, that I couldn't possibly love their son for anything other than his money. It took years for them to accept me,
And even then, I always felt like I was on probation. So why did you treat me the same way? Carol's smile was bitter, because I'd worked so hard to earn my place in this world. And here you came, threatening to remind everyone that I wasn't born to it. I saw you as a reflection of who I used to be, and I hated that reflection. That's not an excuse for how you behaved. No, it's not. It's an explanation, and it's the truth, which is more than I've given you in 2 years. For the first time since I'd met her, Carol seemed genuinely human rather than like a perfectly polished facade. Where do we go from here? I asked. I don't know, but I'd like to try to build something real with you, instead of the performance I've been giving. If you're willing. Looking at her across the small table in the restaurant, where I'd served countless customers over the past 2 years, I realized that my inheritance had given me something more valuable than money. It had given me the power to choose forgiveness on my own terms, rather than being forced into it by circumstances. I'd like that too, I said. But it has to be real, Carol. No more tests, no more subtle put-downs, no more treating me like I'm lucky to be tolerated. Deal, she said, extending her hand across the table. As I shook hands with my future mother-in-law in the middle of Romano's dining room, I realized that sometimes the most profound changes come not from the money itself, but from the confidence it gives you to demand the respect you've always deserved. 6 months after the inheritance revelation, Michael and I were planning our engagement party. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same family who had once questioned my motives for dating their son was now eager to claim me as their own. But genuine change takes time, and I was cautiously optimistic about the progress we'd all made. The real test came when the Pemberton family decided to contest the will after all. Harrison Pemberton's surviving children, my grandmother's siblings, had hired a team of lawyers to challenge my inheritance. Their argument was simple: if Rose had truly rejected the family fortune, then her descendants shouldn't be entitled to claim it decades later. The legal battle was brutal and public. Suddenly my story was splashed across financial newspapers and society magazines. The narrative was irresistible: the secret heiress who'd been working as a waitress, the family fortune hidden for decades, the bitter legal fight over millions of dollars. Richard proved his genuine acceptance of me during this period by offering the full resources of Thompson Financial Group to help manage the legal complexities. Family protects family, he told me simply when I tried to protest that it wasn't his fight. But it was Michael's unwavering support that meant the most. When reporters started camping outside our apartment building, he moved us into a corporate suite downtown and hired security without asking my permission. When gossip columnists tried to paint our relationship as a calculated merger of fortunes, he publicly defended our love story in ways that would have mortified the old version of himself. The turning point in the legal battle came when Victoria Blackwood's team uncovered my grandmother's private journals. Rose had documented her decision to walk away from the Pemberton fortune, but she'd also written extensively about her hope that someday her descendants might have the opportunity to reclaim their heritage if they chose. One entry, dated just months before my birth, read, "I pray that my granddaughter will have choices I never had. If she inherits strength along with whatever money may come her way, perhaps she can build bridges where I could only see walls." The journals didn't just establish my legal right to the inheritance, they revealed the depth of my grandmother's sacrifice and her hope for reconciliation between the family's divided branches. Reading her words, I understood that she'd seen her choice not as an ending, but as a beginning. The Pemberton family's case crumbled after the journals were presented to the court. More importantly, Harrison Pemberton's eldest son, my great-uncle Charles, reached out to me directly. He was in his 70s now, with grandchildren of his own, and he'd grown tired of the family's bitter feuds. "Your grandmother was the best of us," he told me during our first meeting. "She had principles we should have admired instead of punishing. I've spent 50 years regretting how we treated her." The legal settlement we eventually reached was more generous than anything I could have hoped for. Not only did I retain my full inheritance, but the Pemberton family welcomed me back with genuine warmth. Charles offered me a position on the board of Pemberton Industries, which I accepted with the understanding that I'd be learning the business from the ground up. But the most meaningful change came in my relationship with the Thompson family. Carol and I had developed what could only be described as a real friendship. She'd started volunteering at a literacy program I'd funded, using her organizational skills to help adult learners, in ways that reminded me why Michael had inherited his compassion from somewhere. Jennifer surprised me by becoming one of my closest confidants. She'd confessed that she'd always felt pressure to be perfect in her parents' eyes, and watching me stand up for myself had inspired her to be more authentic in her own relationships. Even Richard had evolved. He'd started treating me as a true partner in family decisions, asking my opinion on everything from investment strategies to vacation planning. More importantly, he'd begun sharing stories about his own struggles to live up to family expectations, helping me understand that wealth could be its own kind of prison. The engagement party itself was everything I'd never known I wanted. Instead of the elaborate society affair Carol would have planned 2 years earlier, we hosted it at the renovated community center in my grandmother's old neighborhood. 3 generations of both families, mixed with friends from Romano's, colleagues from Pemberton Industries, and neighbors who'd known my grandmother as the kind woman who helped with their children's homework. Michael's proposal speech reduced half the room to tears, including himself. "Emma taught me that love isn't about finding someone who fits into your world," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "It's about building a new world together, one that's better than either of you could create alone." But it was Carol's toast that surprised everyone most. 2 years ago, I thought Emma wasn't good enough for my son, she said, raising her glass. I was wrong, my son wasn't good enough for Emma. None of us were, but she's made us all better people just by refusing to accept less than she deserved. As I looked around the room that night, at faces that represented every chapter of my journey, I realized that my inheritance had given me something far more valuable than money. It had given me the confidence to demand authentic relationships, the power to create positive change, and the wisdom to understand that true wealth comes from the connections we build with other people. The woman who'd once apologized for existing had learned to take up space in the world. The waitress who'd been dismissed as a gold digger had become a philanthropist who understood the difference between having money and being defined by it. The daughter-in-law who'd begged for acceptance had transformed into a family member who commanded respect through her character rather than her bank account. 6 months later, as I walked down the aisle toward Michael, I carried my grandmother's pearl necklace and a letter she'd written to me before I was born. In it she'd expressed her hope that I would find love that valued my heart over my circumstances, that I would have the courage to stand up for myself, and that I would use whatever advantages life gave me to lift others up. Looking into Michael's eyes as we exchanged vows, I knew that Rose Pemberton Walsh would have been proud of the choices I'd made, and the woman I'd become. The inheritance had changed my bank account, but love, courage, and the refusal to accept less than I deserved had changed my life. As we danced our first dance as husband and wife, surrounded by family members who'd learned to see past their assumptions and friends who'd supported me through every transformation, I realized that the most valuable legacy my grandmother had left me wasn't money at all. It was the example of a woman who chose love over expectation, principle over convenience, and authenticity over acceptance. The little waitress fantasy, as Carol had once called me, had become a reality none of us could have imagined. But it wasn't the fantasy of catching a rich husband that had come true. It was the fantasy of being valued for who I truly was, of building relationships based on mutual respect, rather than financial calculation, and of discovering that real power comes not from what you have, but from knowing your own worth. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money at all. Sometimes it's the courage to demand the love and respect you've always deserved, and the wisdom to recognize it when it finally comes. 3 years into our marriage, Michael and I received an unexpected invitation that would test just how far the Thompson family had truly come. Harrison Pemberton's Memorial Foundation was hosting its annual gala, and as his great-granddaughter and now a board member of Pemberton Industries, I was being honored as the keynote speaker. The invitation itself was elegant, printed on heavy cardstock with gold embossing, but it was the handwritten note at the bottom that caught my attention. We would be honored to have the entire Thompson family join us for this celebration of Harrison's legacy and Emma's vision for the future. Charles Pemberton. I showed the invitation to Michael over breakfast, watching his expression carefully. Even after all this time, I sometimes wondered if he still felt overshadowed by my wealth, despite his own family's success. The entire Thompson family, he read aloud, then looked up at me with a grin. Uncle Charles certainly doesn't do anything halfway, does he? Are you comfortable with this? I asked. It's going to be a very Pemberton-heavy evening. Lots of talk about the family business and legacy. Michael reached across the table and took my hand. Emma, I've learned something over the past few years. Your success doesn't diminish mine.
Your family's history doesn't erase mine. We're building something new together, and that's what matters. His words were exactly what I needed to hear, but I could still see a flicker of something in his eyes. Not jealousy, exactly, but perhaps the weight of constantly being introduced as Emma Pemberton Thompson's husband at business events. The gala was being held at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, the same venue where Michael's parents had held their charity events for decades. As we arrived, I was struck by how different this felt from those early days when I'd felt so out of place in their social circles. Now photographers called my name, board members sought my opinion, and society reporters treated my attendance as the main story of the evening. Carol had insisted on coming early to help me prepare, a gesture that would have seemed impossible during our first meetings. She'd become not just a mother-in-law but a genuine friend and advisor, someone who understood the complexities of navigating high society better than almost anyone. You look radiant, she said as she helped me adjust my dress, a midnight blue gown that had been custom-made for the occasion. But more importantly, you look confident. That's the real transformation I've witnessed in you. Some days I still can't believe this is my life, I admitted, checking my appearance one final time in the mirror. Believe it, you've earned every bit of recognition you're receiving tonight. Not because of your inheritance, but because of what you've done with it. Carol was right. In the 3 years since claiming my inheritance, I'd worked tirelessly to honor my grandmother's memory while building something meaningful for the future. The literacy program I'd founded had expanded to serve 5 cities. The scholarship fund I'd established for working students had already helped over 200 people complete their education. And my work on the Pemberton Industries Board had helped steer the company toward more sustainable and socially responsible practices. But tonight felt different. Tonight I wasn't just Emma who happened to be wealthy. I was Emma Pemberton Thompson, a leader in my own right, someone who'd found her voice and wasn't afraid to use it. The ballroom was magnificent, decorated in deep jewel tones that complemented the autumn theme. Nearly 300 guests had gathered, representing not just the business and social elite, but also the communities that had benefited from the foundation's work. I'd insisted on that mix, wanting tonight to be about more than just wealthy people congratulating themselves. Michael's entire family was there, dressed in their finest and clearly proud to be included in such a prestigious event. Richard had even worn the vintage cufflinks his father had given him, ones he reserved for only the most special occasions. Jennifer and her husband David were chatting animatedly with some of the younger board members, and I could see that Jennifer was in her element, discussing legal strategies and corporate governance with obvious expertise. But it was the presence of my Romano's family that meant the most to me. I'd arranged for my former coworkers to attend, along with several of the regular customers who'd become friends over the years. They were somewhat overwhelmed by the grandeur of the event, but their presence grounded me in a way that all the society credentials in the world couldn't. Maria, the head server who'd trained me during my first week at Romano's, approached me during the cocktail hour. "Look at you now," she said, her eyes bright with pride. "I always knew you were special, Mia, but this is beyond anything I could have imagined. None of this changes who I am at heart," I told her, and I meant it. I'm still the girl who burned her first order of breadsticks because she was too nervous to watch the timer. Maybe Maria laughed, but now you're the girl who burns breadsticks and owns half the city. The evening's program began with remarks from Charles Pemberton, who'd become not just my great-uncle but a genuine mentor and friend. He spoke about his father's vision for the company and foundation, but he also talked about redemption and second chances, about how families could heal from old wounds if people were willing to do the hard work of forgiveness. Harrison Pemberton made many mistakes in his life, Charles said, his voice carrying across the ballroom, but one of his greatest regrets was losing his daughter Rose because of pride and stubbornness. Tonight we celebrate not just his legacy, but the return of his granddaughter's family to where they belong. Emma has shown us that inheritance isn't just about money or property. It's about values, vision, and the courage to build something better than what came before.
When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the podium feeling more nervous than I had in years. This wasn't just another corporate presentation or charity luncheon. This was my opportunity to define not just my own legacy, but my grandmother's as well. 3 years ago, I learned that my grandmother Rose had walked away from all of this. From the wealth, the status, the security that the Pemberton name represented. For decades I thought she'd given up everything for love. Now I understand that she hadn't given up anything at all. She'd simply chosen to build her wealth in a different currency. I paused looking out at the assembled crowd, seeing faces that represented every chapter of my journey. Rose Pemberton Walsh taught me that the most valuable inheritance isn't money. It's integrity. It's the courage to stand up for what you believe in, even when it costs you everything. It's the wisdom to know that your worth as a human being isn't determined by your bank account or your social connections, but by how you treat other people and what you choose to do with whatever advantages you've been given. I spoke about the scholarship recipients, young people who reminded me of myself just a few years earlier, working multiple jobs while pursuing their education. I talked about the literacy program participants, adults who'd been dismissed by a society that equated educational credentials with intelligence and worth. I shared stories about small business owners who'd received microloans from the foundation, immigrants who'd found their footing through our workforce development programs, and children who'd discovered their love of reading in the libraries we'd funded. Every one of these programs exists because my grandmother taught me that privilege comes with responsibility. I continued. Not the responsibility to maintain the status quo, but the responsibility to use whatever advantages you have to create opportunities for others. As I spoke, I could see Michael in the audience, his face glowing with pride. Beside him, Carol was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Richard nodded approvingly at various points in my speech. The transformation in their attitudes toward me had been gradual but complete, and I realized that earning their respect had been worth every difficult conversation and awkward family dinner. But the moment that made the entire evening meaningful came during the reception afterward. A young woman approached me hesitantly, introducing herself as Sarah Martinez, one of the scholarship recipients from the program's first year. "Miss Thompson," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "I don't know if you remember me, but you funded my last 2 years of nursing school." I did remember her. Sarah had been working 3 jobs while caring for her younger siblings after their parents died in a car accident. Her essay about wanting to become a nurse so she could help other families during their most vulnerable moments had moved me to tears. "Of course I remember you, Sarah. How is everything going?" "I graduated last month," she said, her face lighting up with pride. "I'm working in the pediatric intensive care unit at Metropolitan General Hospital, and I wanted to tell you something. Yesterday I helped save the life of a little boy who'd been in a terrible accident. As I was working on him, I kept thinking about how none of this would have been possible without your scholarship. That little boy is going home to his family because you believed in me when no one else would." For a moment I couldn't speak. All the board meetings and corporate strategies and foundation galas faded away, replaced by the simple truth of what really mattered. A child was alive because resources had been used to help someone achieve her potential. A family was whole because privilege had been converted into opportunity. "You did that, Sarah," I finally managed to say. "The scholarship just opened a door. You walked through it and became everything you were meant to be." "But that's what I wanted to tell you," Sarah continued. "The scholarship didn't just change my life. It taught me that I had an obligation to help others the way you helped me. I'm starting a support group for first-generation college students in healthcare programs. I want to pass on what you gave me." As Sarah walked away to rejoin her table, I felt Michael's arm slide around my waist. "Feeling pretty good about your investment portfolio?" he asked softly. "Better than I've ever felt about any financial return," I replied. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations, networking conversations, and heartfelt stories from people whose lives had been touched by the foundation's work. But it was the quiet moment at the end of the night that I treasured most. As the ballroom emptied and the cleanup crews began their work, the Thompson family gathered around one of the remaining tables for an impromptu family meeting. It wasn't planned, but somehow we all sensed that this was a moment worth marking. "I have something to say," Richard announced, his voice unusually formal. "Emma, when you first came into our family, I was skeptical, not because of your background or your finances, but because I couldn't understand what you saw in my son." Michael laughed. "Thanks, Dad. Let me finish, Richard continued with a smile. I was wrong. You didn't see something in Michael that the rest of us missed. You brought out something in him that we'd never fully appreciated. And more than that, you've brought out the best in all of us. Carol nodded emphatically. You've taught us that family isn't about maintaining traditions or protecting status. It's about supporting each other's growth and celebrating each other's successes, even when those successes challenge us to be better people. Jennifer raised her glass of champagne. To Emma, who showed us that the most dangerous thing you can do to a strong woman is underestimate her. To Emma, they all echoed, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the alcohol and everything to do with finally belonging somewhere completely and authentically. As we made our way home that night, Michael and I walked in comfortable silence through the city streets. The Grand Metropolitan Hotel faded behind us, but the feeling of accomplishment and connection lingered. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd never inherited the money? Michael asked as we reached our building. I considered the question seriously. I think about it sometimes. We probably would have gotten married eventually, but it would have taken longer for your family to accept me. I might never have found the confidence to stand up to them, or to pursue the kind of work I'm doing now. Do you think we would have been happy? I think we would have been happy, I said, but we might not have been as strong. The money didn't create our love, but it did give me the power to demand that our love be respected by everyone around us. Michael stopped walking and turned to face me. I need to tell you something I've never said before. What's that? I was intimidated by your inheritance at first, not because I cared about the money itself, but because I was afraid you'd realize you could do better than me. That you could have anyone you wanted, and you'd figure out that included people more successful, more interesting, more worthy of someone like you. His honesty took my breath away. Michael, but watching you tonight, seeing how you've used your advantages to lift other people up, understanding the kind of leader you've become, I realized something. I'm not lucky because I married a rich woman. I'm lucky because I married an extraordinary woman who happens to be rich. There's a difference. I kissed him there on the sidewalk, not caring about the late-night pedestrians walking around us, or the photographers who might be lurking nearby. In that moment, I understood that we'd both completed journeys that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with understanding our own worth. Back in our apartment, I found myself looking through the photo albums we'd accumulated over the past few years. Pictures from our wedding, from family gatherings, from foundation events and quiet moments at home. In the early photos, I could see the uncertainty in my eyes, the way I held myself as if I were afraid of taking up too much space. But in the recent pictures, I saw someone different. A woman who knew her own value, who'd learned to command respect rather than beg for acceptance, who'd discovered that true power comes not from what you have, but from what you choose to do with it. The last photo in the album was from earlier that evening, taken during my speech. I was standing at the podium with complete confidence, addressing a room full of influential people who were listening to my words because they respected my vision, not just my bank account. Behind me, projected on a large screen, was a photo of my grandmother Rose, young and radiant and full of hope for the future. Looking at that image, I realized that Rose Pemberton Walsh had gotten everything she'd wanted after all. She'd chosen love over money, principle over convenience, authenticity over acceptance. And in doing so, she'd raised a family that valued those same principles. The inheritance I'd received wasn't just financial. It was moral and emotional and spiritual, a legacy of courage that had been passed down through generations. The woman who'd once been dismissed as a gold-digging waitress had become a philanthropist, a business leader, and a bridge between different worlds. But more importantly, she'd become someone who knew that the most valuable thing you can inherit isn't money at all. It's the wisdom to know your own worth, and the courage to demand that others recognize it too. As I closed the photo album and prepared for bed, I thought about Sarah Martinez and the little boy whose life she'd saved, about the scholarship recipients who would graduate next year, and the literacy program participants who were discovering new worlds through reading. I thought about the Thompson family and how our relationships had evolved from tolerance to genuine love and respect. Most of all, I thought about my grandmother Rose, who'd given up a fortune to follow her heart, and in doing so had left me something far more valuable than money. The example of a woman who refused to compromise her values for anyone's approval. The inheritance had changed everything and nothing. I was still the same person who'd served coffee and dreamed of better days, who'd fallen in love with a kind man and hoped his family would accept her. But now I was also someone who understood that acceptance earned through pretense isn't worth having, that love that requires you to diminish yourself isn't really love at all, and that the greatest wealth comes from knowing who you are and refusing to apologize for it. Sometimes the most valuable inheritance is simply the courage to become who you were always meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.